A lot going on today. We got a lot coming up. Matt Continetti will be along. Ben Domenech, Senator Cotton after the break. But I want to go right to the White House this afternoon with breaking news. President Trump had all the nation's governors at the White House today, and he had a few things to say to them. Cut number 11.
The American people expect every city and state to fully honor ICE detainer requests, and we hope they can, and to ensure the safe transfer of criminal aliens into federal custody for immediate removal from our country. You know, many of the countries said, we're not ever going to let them back. Under the Biden administration, I remember it's Venezuela. He's a tough guy. And others, they said, we're not letting them back. They're out of here, and you'll never bring them back. They're not coming into this country. And Biden said, oh, we can't bring them back. They won't take them. Well, we took them. And every single country now, you saw it with Colombia, you saw it with Venezuela. In fact, they actually offered to send planes to pick them up, and they'll pick them up so that we don't have to go through the expense of sending a plane. Is that correct, Marco? Even Marco couldn't believe that one. But they literally are sending planes to pick up these people. And they're rough people, and they're picking them up, and they're putting them in the planes.
That's what he wants. Cut number 12.
Yesterday, I had Tim Cook in the office from Apple. He's investing hundreds of billions of dollars. I don't know. I hope he's announced it. Hope I didn't announce this, but what the hell? All I do is tell the truth. That's what he told me. Now he has to do it, right? So it's a good. But he's investing hundreds of billions of dollars, and others too. We're going to have a lot of chip makers coming in, a lot of automakers coming in. They stopped 2 plants in Mexico. They were under construction, starting construction. They just stopped them. They're going to build here instead because they don't want to pay the tariffs. The tariffs are amazing. It's good. I got myself in a lot of trouble. I said it's my favorite word in the dictionary, the word tariff. It's such a beautiful word. And the fake news killed me. They said, what about love? What about God? What about family? And they said, I'm in trouble. I said, so now it's my 4th favorite word. I say, love, God, family. A couple of others I could add in there too, but it's my 4th favorite word. So
he is a master communicator. One last cut. Not good for my friends up in Maine. Cut number 14.
The NCAA has complied immediately, by the way. That's good. But I understand Maine. Is Maine here, the governor of Maine? Well, are you not going to comply with it?
I'm complying with state and federal laws.
We are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding.
See you in court.
Every state, good. I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one.
Oh, Governor Mills.
And enjoy your life after governor because I don't think you'll be in elected politics.
Oh, Governor Mills. No, bad choice. Bad choice. I like Maine. I love Maine. Bad choice of Governor Mills because, you know, I saw the picture this week of the trans girl beating out the girls. They were, I don't know what the competition was. It was pole vault in Maine. And I just shook my head. And I said, this isn't right. These girls train their whole life. And a trans girl beats them by a half foot. I mean, just destroyed them. It's just not right to the coaches, to the athletes, to the families, to the friends, but especially to the competitors. Now I want to go to Marco Rubio, who gave a big, in-depth interview to Catherine Herridge about what is going on. Let's start with his comments on President Zelensky of Ukraine. Cut number 1.
When President Trump posts that President Zelensky is a dictator without elections, what are you thinking?
I think President Trump is very upset at President Zelensky, and in some cases, and rightfully so. Look, number one, Joe Biden had frustrations with Zelensky. People shouldn't forget it. There are newspaper articles out there about how he cursed at him in a phone call because Zelensky, instead of saying thank you for all your help, is immediately out there messaging what we're not doing or what he's not getting. I think the second thing is, frankly, I was personally very upset because we had a conversation with President Zelensky, the vice president and I, the three of us. And we discussed this issue about the mineral rights. And we explained to them, look, we want to be in a joint venture with you, not because we're trying to steal from your country, but because we think that's actually a security guarantee. If we're your partner in an important economic endeavor, we get to get paid back some of the money the taxpayers have given, close to $200 billion. And it also, now we have a vested interest in the security of Ukraine. And he said, sure, we want to do this deal. It makes all the sense in the world. The only thing is I need to run it through my legislative process. They have to approve it. I read 2 days later that Zelensky's out there saying, I rejected the deal. I told him, no way, that we're not doing that. Well, that's not what happened in that meeting. So you start to get upset by somebody. We're trying to help these guys. One of the points that the president made in his messaging is not that we don't care about Ukraine, but Ukraine is on another continent. You know, it doesn't directly impact the daily lives of Americans. We care about it because it has implications for our allies and ultimately for the world. There should be some level of gratitude here about this. And when you don't see it and you see him out there accusing the president of living in a world of disinformation, that's very counterproductive. And I don't need to explain to you or anybody else, President Trump's not the kind of person that's going to sit there and take that. He's very transparent. He's going to tell you exactly how he feels. And he sent a message that he's not going to get gamed here. He's willing to work on peace because he cares about Ukraine. And he hopes Zelensky will be a partner in that, and not someone who's out there putting this sort of counter messaging to try to, hustle us in that regard. That's not going to be productive here.
Cut number 3, Secretary of State Rubio again to Catherine Herridge.
If I can just jump in, what I'm hearing you say is that in the last 4 years, there's been a breakdown in communication with China and also Russia.
Well, interestingly enough, the communication with China has actually been better than the communication with the Russians under the Biden administration and to the current day, which is why there has to be some level of maturity here and practicality and pragmatism when it comes to foreign policy. That said, we're not going to live in a world where we depend on China for critical rare earth minerals, for critical components in our supply chain. We're not going to live in a world in which China gets to dominate the Indo-Pacific, and we're not allowed to have commercial ties in that region because they're holding countries hostage, and they all become tributary states. The Japanese have no interest in being a tributary state, and they're close allies of ours. The South Koreans, the Philippines, Australia. None of these countries want to become tributary states. Vietnam, for that matter, are not interested in becoming sort of tributary states in a Chinese zone of influence. We are a Pacific nation. We intend to remain one and maintain our relationships there. So that is a red line for us. We're not going to abandon, our engagement as a Pacific power. And by the other token, we're not going to live in a world where the Chinese dominate things that are critical to our economy and be held hostage by them. That's just silly to do it. Some of that involves improving our domestic industrial
That might be a
capability.
Dean Acheson moment. He did not mention Taiwan. He mentioned Japan, Australia, the Philippines, Vietnam. Did not mention Taiwan. Don't know if it was intentional. I heard what I didn't hear. Then we have the National Security Advisor, Waltz, at CPAC, cut number 10.
President Trump is who pivoted us, pivoted the whole national security apparatus back in 2017 and 2018 to deal with the threat and the competition that China is. But he firmly believes we can win this economically, we can win this through our supply chains, we can win this through our markets and fair trade deals, and at the same time rebuilding our great military under, how about our Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, right? Getting them focused on being the most lethal and most badass military in the world and projecting that strength. But at the same time, he appreciates the infiltration that's going on, and we just had Panama say, you know what, we're done with Belt and Road, we're done with allowing China to infiltrate critical strategic assets like the Panama Canal. And again, it's only been a month, folks. We've still got it. We told the president, you said, you have a full 4 years. We don't have to get it all done in 4 weeks. And just final thing, because you mentioned fentanyl. We are going to unleash holy hell on the cartels. Enough is enough. We are securing our border. And the cartels are on notice. You've seen images of the Mexican army doing joint patrols with our border, with our Customs and Border Police, and with our military to secure the United States border, because without a border, you don't have a country and you don't have sovereignty. And if there's not anything more than America first than that. And so,
all right, now I want you to remember,
going back.
We got Waltz, we got Ratcliffe at the CIA, we got Kash Patel at the FBI, we got Marco Rubio at State. We have Pete Hegseth at the Department of Defense, and we have Susie Wiles as the Chief of Staff. There are a lot of people, and the Vice President, J.D. Vance, had a great week. We got a lot of people advising the President. Politico is trying to divide them. I know they won't let that happen. I know that. I know these people. They're not going to let that happen. I want to remind you, Pragertopia. Well, you could hear this today at Pragertopia.
The Hebrew Bible brought into humanity a notion completely foreign to every religion on the face of the earth. Many such things. But one is love God. I have never found loving God easy. That's what this Ultimate Issues Hour is about.
All of that and more if you join Pragertopia.com. Don't go through cold turkey until Dennis gets back. Just go listen to him at Pragertopia.com. All week long I've been talking with Senator Tom Cotton about his brand new book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. It's in bookstores now. It's going to ruffle a lot of feathers. I don't think it's going to come out in Mandarin in China, Senator, do you?
Well, seeing as how I'm still sanctioned by China and can't travel there, even if it did, I wouldn't be able to go to do any book events. So I suspect
I just don't think we're going to see it there. And I wouldn't take it in your luggage if you're planning on going to China. I wouldn't go to China, period. I want to talk about the most troubling chapter. China has infiltrated our government. It's chapter 5. This is part 6 of my conversation with Senator Cotton. China is targeting the infiltration of our military, Senator. And I'll just start with last year, an Army intel analyst transferred vast amounts of classified information on how we plan to defeat an invasion of China for the overwhelming sum of $42,000.
Yeah.
Do we have an after-action impact report on how much damage that soldier did?
Not that I've seen that I can recall, Hugh, but I do think it's important to note that, the vast majority of our troops are loyal, patriotic Americans. But anytime you have an organization as large as our military, of course, you're going to have some bad apples in it. And regrettably, China can identify some of those bad apples and pay them off, in this case, an actual relatively modest sum to get very sensitive information. That's true not just in our military, but it's also true in our defense industry, whether it's old-fashioned classic espionage of buying off people to get blueprints or plans or what have you, or through cyber attacks, stealing them from some of our big defense contractors, some of our new cutting-edge defense contractors. China has a very clear plan to target our military and target our defense industry. It's one reason, if you've seen pictures on the internet, while their aircraft that usually are built a few years after our aircraft look a lot like our aircraft.
I go back to the series The Americans, which is set in the 1980s when the Soviets were running these games, and they would send honeypots down to Virginia Beach to try and catch lonely 18-year-olds. Here I read, in 2023, 2 sailors gave up info on our Navy assets stationed in Japan. Again, for $20,000. It doesn't even seem possible that they would do it for $20,000, but I guess that's a lot of money to a sailor that's just in the service.
Yeah. For a junior enlisted, and sometimes they may not even realize the implications of what they're doing. But it's a good thing, I think, Hugh, that you brought up the show The Americans, which was set back in the old Cold War. Many view that as kind of a period piece. It's like watching an Old West movie. It's not a period piece. It is happening today. China is doing it. Russia's also doing it. But for our purposes, China is doing everything that you saw Russia do during the Cold War. China is doing as well. It's only doing it on an even bigger scale because it's 10 times the size of old communist Russia. And it's enabled by advanced technologies through cyber attacks or artificial intelligence. So the spy movies that you see or the spy novels you read from the Cold War period, they're not period pieces. They're not historic relics. That's what China is doing to us right now, in addition to all kinds of newfangled ways of essentially conducting espionage and influence operations against our country's leadership.
Before I go back to those 290,000 students, I want to ask you about the Northrop Grumman engineer, because we were talking about soldiers and sailors. They've also bribed a Northrop Grumman engineer for specs on the B-2. So I assume everybody in every sensitive defense industry is a target, Senator Cotton.
Oh, yeah, there's no question about that. If you work for a defense contractor, if you do any work for the Department of Defense or the intelligence community, or even maybe are just around it, you're targeted by the Chinese communist. You may not even have anything to do with it. You may be an HR, you may be an assistant to someone, but you never know if you're China, so it's worth probing everyone. That's why they mount so many cyber attacks against us every single day, collecting all these disparate strands because they never know what they're going to stumble onto.
Well, that brings us to the grains of sand analogy, which I hadn't seen before. It's on page 117. You want to explain the difference between the Soviets and the Chi-Coms?
Soviet espionage, you might say, is more kind of elegant or surgical. They, are looking to cultivate assets and identify them and then have a long-term relationship. China, again, because of its massive size, has more of just kind of a brute force approach. They'll just try to walk Chinese nationals right onto a military base, see what they can find out. They'll target the computers of everyone working at a defense company, seeing who they can get to click on a malicious link. They're collecting, thousands of grains of sand, and then they'll sort through it all later.
The gate crashing you just referenced, and you list them all in 7 things you can't say about China. They try and roll through. Now, I am used to dealing with CCP journalists when I ran the Nixon Library, and they were always impossible to deal with because they don't even have the manners of the Western press. But this is pretty remarkable. They try and crash gates all the time.
Yeah, and we shouldn't be surprised that they're willing to do that kind of thing, because look what they did 2 years ago. They floated a spy balloon all across America to spy on nuclear facilities. And we probably wouldn't have even known it happened if a rancher in Montana hadn't spotted it, because I think the Biden administration was willing to let it go unannounced and maybe even unnoticed to China, because I don't think they wanted to sour Secretary of State Blinken's trip to China later that week. So we shouldn't be surprised at the brazenness of China. They've been this brazen for years. I just think so many Americans in positions of leadership still want to turn the other cheek and ignore it or stick their head in the sand because of the vast influence and leverage China has built up in our society.
Now, I want to make sure people understand that when Senator Cotton writes about the new China lobby, he is looking on both sides of the aisle. It's not just about Hunter Biden. He's talking about members of the Bush family, the Biden family, Senators Vitter and Boxer, Trent Lott, John Breaux, aides to Paul Ryan, aides to Harry Reid, aides to Bill Frist. Honestly, who isn't working for him? I'm not, well, you're not, but my goodness, I guess I missed it.
Yeah, it's a very, very, very unfortunate development in Washington over the last 30 years or so, what I call the new China lobby. The old China lobby was standing up for Taiwan and trying to make sure that we armed Taiwan before we switched our diplomatic recognition in the 1970s, that we stood by Taiwan, which is the only democracy on Chinese soil today. The new China lobby is the exact opposite. The new China lobby is defending communist China. It's always taking its side. It's lobbying Congress. It's lobbying any administration to be soft on China, not just for, say, a particular industry or special interest, but overall. So, like, if you have an interest in China, China wants you not just to protect that single interest, say you're manufacturing, small machine tool parts. Well, they don't want you just talking to your congressman or senator about tariffs on those parts. They want you talking to them about Hong Kong or the Uyghur genocide. Or tariffs across the board. China uses that economic leverage it has to develop a de facto new China lobby, and it is unfortunately bipartisan.
It's also in Arkansas. When you told the story about Sun Paper, I've talked to you a lot over the years. I'd never heard that before. They were using Sun Paper, I think, obviously, to get to you.
Yeah, I think it was a big project, so-called super project. It never came to pass because China kept dragging it out. They kept dangling it in front of our governor and legislature. And Governor Asa Hutchinson at the time made multiple requests for me to go to the consulate in Houston or to meet with consular officials in Arkansas. And I explained, when I'm home in Arkansas, I'm meeting with Arkansans. And if Chinese officials wanted to meet with me, they could do it in Washington from the embassy. And he explained then, but the consulate in Houston is what's in charge of economic relationships in Arkansas. So at that point, I was certainly not going to meet with them because that was an effort for them to try to use that project for leverage against me, not just about that project, but of all Chinese relationships. And I would remind you that a few years later, Donald Trump shut down that consulate because it was a den of spies.
Joined by Matt Continetti. Matt is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He is a columnist for the Washington Free Beacon. He is the Washington editor for Commentary Magazine, and I hear him most days on the Commentary podcast. Hello, Matt. Thank you for joining me on this Friday. Always good to see you.
Always good to see you, Hugh. Thanks for having me.
I listened with great interest yesterday as you opined on Yalta. John Podhoretz reminded me you are a historian. Your book, The Right, is fabulous. So I'm going to throw a historian's question at you to open this up.
Okay.
Trump is to Zelensky as FDR was to blank.
Well, I mean, the easiest answer would be Churchill.
No.
I'm not sure.
Nope.
No? Okay.
De Gaulle. A troublesome and necessary person with whom you have to deal, but who gives you heartburn at every turn. And more for Churchill than FDR. But what do you make of this?
Yes. Well, it's a fascinating development, Hugh. I think the relations breakdown between Washington and Ukraine over the past week illustrates is the personalist aspect to Donald Trump's foreign policy. The more we learn about what's happened over the past few days, the more we begin to understand that Zelensky made some critical errors, I think, in dealing with the United States and more specifically with the Trump administration. It seems that he rejected out of hand this resource deal that the Trump administration first presented to him in the person of Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. And then he subsequently rejected it in meetings with Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance during the Munich conference. Then he rejected it publicly. And then when Rubio, Waltz, and Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, met with Sergei Lavrov last week in Riyadh, or even earlier this week, it's all coming together, time's a flat circle. Zelensky responded to Trump's criticism as saying Trump lives in a disinformation space. If you know anything about Donald Trump, you know that if you attack him, he's going to attack you back. And so I think these decisions led to what we saw in the breakdown in relationships. But in the past 12 hours, Hugh, I think we now have a chance of reestablishing the relationship under a revised resource agreement that seems to have been worked out through the special envoy, another special envoy, Keith Kellogg, with Zelensky. And that's what our national security advisor, Mike Waltz, spoke to yesterday and again today. So when I look at Zelensky, I think he needs to understand how to deal with Donald Trump. He doesn't have much practice with it, right? And he came in. We, of course, had the 2019 perfect phone call. Then we had the pandemic. And then there was 4 years of Trump out of power. The war begins, this latest stage of the war begins in 2022 with Joe Biden in office. I don't think Zelensky has much experience with Trump and the MAGA movement and the way it's developed in recent years. And I was remember, Hugh, in September when Zelensky visited the munitions factory in Pennsylvania in the middle of the general election campaign alongside the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, and the Democratic congressman in Pennsylvania's 8th district, then Matt Cartwright. Well, Cartwright lost. He lost to a Republican. And Trump won Pennsylvania. And so I think that Zelensky needs to understand that he's dealing in separate circumstances. He's dealing with Donald Trump now, and he needs to learn how to operate and speak Trump in a way he hasn't before.
Yeah, I've got a lot of experience with that, Matt. And I also have a couple of Trump tattoos, having interviewed him 30 times in public, on public. And you get Trump tattoos, and you learn how to do it to the benefit of both parties. And I really don't know who's advising Zelensky, but because to take to X to criticize your client, and they are our client. I mean, we give them the money. We give them the arms. I was astonished by the naivete, and I think there are a lot of people in American media, certainly the Democratic Party, who would rather see Trump fail than a ceasefire that is stable succeed. Do you agree with me?
Well, I agree that this war in Ukraine has been politicized from the start, Hugh. I think that one reason President Biden was so slow to deliver the weapon systems that Ukraine needed at critical points in the war was because Biden and the Democratic Party thought that they could divide the Republican Party over support for Ukraine. And that political calculation did not work out in Biden's advantage. And my reference to the congressman who lost last year is a part of a broader pattern. And I think we're going to see that in the coming German elections as well.
Schultz is going to get wiped
Ukraine,
out.
Exactly. Governments that support Ukraine don't do well, and Zelensky needs to understand that.
I think you said on commentary yesterday, or maybe Abe did, he overpromises and underdelivers. I still want him to win, and I still think he's a brave and courageous leader. But you can't do that to your allies, especially to your patrons. I want to play for you, Matt, something Marco Rubio said to Catherine Herridge today in a lengthy interview at the State Department, cut number 3.
If I can just jump in, what I'm hearing you say is that in the last 4 years, there's been a breakdown in communication with China and also Russia.
Well, interestingly enough, the communication with China has actually been better than the communication with the Russians under the Biden administration and to the current day, which is why there has to be some level of maturity here and practicality and pragmatism when it comes to foreign policy. That said, we're not going to live in a world where we depend on China for critical rare earth minerals, for critical components in our supply chain. We're not going to live in a world in which China gets to dominate the Indo-Pacific, and we're not allowed to have commercial ties in that region because they're holding countries hostage, and they all become tributary states. The Japanese have no interest in being a tributary state, and they're close allies of ours. The South Koreans, the Philippines, Australia. None of these countries want to become tributary states. Vietnam, for that matter, are not interested in becoming sort of tributary states in a Chinese zone of influence.
Matt, what did you hear or not hear there?
Well, I heard that we might be looking for some type of deal with China in the coming months, but I also heard from Secretary Rubio that we need to understand that we can't exist in a dependency with China, that there are certain things that America has to be able to produce on its own. And look, we lived through this before during the pandemic when we had
wait,
the
Matt,
crisis
I
with
want to
masks.
redirect you from I think it was an Atchison moment because I didn't hear Taiwan. I heard Japan, Australia, Philippines, even Vietnam, South Korea, no Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is a part maybe of this deal that's being speculated about inside Washington and inside the Trump administration. So again, it's part of this larger condominium that I think that the Trump administration may be pursuing with China. And that, of course, we also have to remember, though, Hugh, he might not have mentioned Taiwan there, but then we had this episode of the language on Taiwan being changed on the State Department website, where the secretary seems to have removed the language saying that the United States does not support Taiwan independence and replacing it with language saying that we oppose any forceful resolution to the conflict. So we're getting some mixed messages on Taiwan as we are in Ukraine.
And that's very dangerous, isn't it? We have a minute till we come back. It's very dangerous to be unclear about Taiwan.
It's absolutely dangerous. You mentioned Dean Acheson. And that was, of course, as you know, was when Acheson failed to include the South Korea in America's defense perimeter in East Asia. We faced the invasion from North Korea a few months later in the beginning of that terrible conflict from 1950 to 1946.
Stalin heard that, as did Kim Jong-un's grandfather. Matt Continetti is with me. Follow him on X. Matt, as you mentioned, we have shuttles diplomacy going on. We've got a couple of special envoys in Witkoff and Kellogg. We've got the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor. We've got John Ratcliffe in some of these meetings from the CIA. And soon we'll have Kash Patel in some of these things. Susie Wiles is off to the side, and the President's calling all the shots. I have four sides to my square. Russia, Putin is evil, but Russia is a great power. We can't defeat it. Hamas is evil, and it has to be destroyed. Iran is evil, and it could be defeated. And China is our greatest adversary, and the best we can do is deter them. Everything I have to make work within that box. Is that an appropriate structure to try and understand all this stuff going on?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it speaks to the complexity and chaos of the world that President Trump inherited. I mean, this was not the case when he left office, that you could talk about all these manifold threats and all these challenges. And now his new administration has to face them all at once. And the second thing I take from your image, your very powerful image of the box there, Hugh, is you can't isolate any of these things. You're going to have to tackle them all at once, and they're interrelated, right? Iran is supplying weapons to Russia that Russia then uses in Ukraine. And China is supplying Russia with finance, with energy, with technology. And Hamas, of course, is a dependency of Iran and related to Iran's malign behavior throughout the Middle East. So you have to understand not only that there are many challenges and crises facing this administration, but also that they are interrelated. And if the end game, if the end result is one that empowers China or Russia, even if we say assist or allow the Israelis to take out the Iranian nuclear program, we would still be living in a dangerous world, perhaps a less dangerous world for sure, but there would still be dangers that remained.
On the commentary podcast this morning, perhaps the most somber since 10/8/23, in the aftermath of the return of the Bibas children, but not their mother, and the identification of the method of death that has been made by the Israelis, Jonathan Shanzer laid out that there are three options going forward. One of them is that after Saturday and the return of 6 hostages, Netanyahu takes off the gloves and America bares its teeth. Do you think that's what's going to happen?
Well, I think it's what should happen. I think it's what Hamas deserves. And I think after the experience of the past few days and just the horrible images and just the visceral feelings, I would say that we should support that wholeheartedly if Israel decides to take the gloves off and resume the war and continue to fight Hamas to the finish. I wonder whether there will be some pressure, though, to engage in some type of phase 2 negotiations, even if I really believe that the reaction in Israel to the Bibas family is so strong that I think the desire to take the fight to Hamas may be more powerful in this moment than the desire to see the remaining hostages released.
You know, Jonathan Shanzer again made the point on commentary this morning that the meeting between Netanyahu and Trump is probably the most important meeting between a prime minister of Israel and a president of the United States since the founding of the State of Israel. I agree with him. What do you think they agreed on?
Well, I really don't know. I mean, it was clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu likes the Trump proposal for the post-war Gaza settlement. It's an out-of-the-box proposal. It's one that challenges the other nations in the region, especially the Arab nations, to come up with their own proposals. And I do think there's a reaction to the Bibas family and the death of these children, these babies, that says, look, the two-state solution is clearly dead. But this idea of not making it possible for Hamas to ever come back to Gaza should be a real one, and we should consider that. And it also makes it much harder to distinguish who is Hamas and who is not. When you see these crowds cheering a coffin parade, I mean, what kind of civilization or culture produces such ghastly imagery, such horrific, disgusting images? So I think that the two figures, Trump and Netanyahu, are on the same page that Hamas has to go, that there can be no future in Gaza with Hamas. The question is, how do we get there? What are the means we use to reach that endpoint? And it's not so clear to me that they agree totally on the means, even if they agree on the ends.
Now, Matt, I want to switch to intellectual history, and we'll talk during the break, and we'll come back for a minute afterwards. You are the author of The Right, so you've done a lot of work on the evolution of the right. I'm a Nixonian guy, and RN used to say over and over again, you got to have Goldwaters, people. You can't win without them, but you can't win just with them. Is that true about the MAGA people who are not the Goldwater people? There might be a little overlap. It's a different coalition, and I really don't have a good handle on how to define it. They like to call me the Uniparty or GOPE, and I don't know what they call you, probably a neocon. But how do we define MAGA?
Well, it's hard. I mean, some people define MAGA just as the Trump coalition, but then there's another definition, which is MAGA are the voters that have been with Trump from the beginning and who stuck with him during his political exile after January 6th up through his winning the nomination in 2024. And I think the other important thing to recognize about 2024 is you had both of those groups of MAGA. So you had the people who were with him from the beginning, who stuck with him during Biden's term when he was the subject of the lawfare, when all the investigations, he was in Mar-a-Lago. But you also had a lot of new people come in 2024, and these are the low propensity voters that Trump was able to bring into his coalition. And they've kind of joined MAGA as well. And I think they're not necessarily political people, they're not necessarily ideological people, but they were certainly anti-Biden and anti-Harris. They wanted change, and they believe Trump can bring change and not only restore the economy of his first term, bring some type of order in the world, but also get rid of all this wokeness, which drove everybody crazy.
Matt, I can do this because we're not on air, and we'll put it on YouTube later. I'll be on special reports to the panel tonight. It's Friday, so we do a winner and loser of the week. My loser is Olaf Scholz because he's going to get wiped out on Sunday. But my winner is Vice President Vance because he has demonstrated, what did Adam say of Jefferson, a peculiar felicity of expression. He did it in Europe. He's doing it online. He did it at CPAC. Where does the vice president fit in the MAGA movement? And do you anticipate down the road a collision between, let's call it, the Cotton wing, the Youngkin wing, and the Vance wings of the GOP? They're different.
Yeah, they are different. They're different wings. But right now, the Trump-Vance wing is in command, and I don't think the other wings are interested in challenging Trump and Vance. I have to say, Hugh, you and I are always thinking alike. J.D. Vance's appearance at CPAC was the third public appearance in a row where I was just frankly bedazzled by his ability to communicate. It was the AI speech last week, then it was the Munich speech, and now we have the CPAC interview where he talked about the domestic politics, he talked about foreign policy, he talked about his religion, he talked about what it means to be a man in 21st century America, all of it fluently, all of it in a way that was accessible but also non-threatening, charming. He talked about his wife, his family, and I have to say, this is a political star. And not just a political star that we kind of saw when Trump made him his VP last summer, and he was already known as the hillbilly elegy guy, the guy that Ron Howard had made the movie about. But now he's become something else. He's clearly the clearest articulator of what it means to belong to MAGA, what it means to be a Trump supporter. And I think that's going to carry him far in the years ahead.
I agree with that. Matt, we're talking about Vice President Vance. What risks does he run politically? Because I think he's in MAGA, but not of it. I think he's his own person. I know Springfield. I know Ohio. I've known the senator for a while, not very well, but long. He's not originally MAGA. He's very Vancian. What risks is he running right now?
Well, and I say this just on pure political terms, any vice president is connected to his boss. He's connected to the incumbent. And so if J.D. Vance wants to run for president in 2028, he certainly wants Donald Trump's endorsement in any nomination process because that would almost guarantee him the nomination. But he also wants the country to be in a good condition. He wants people to be satisfied with the economy. He wants people to think that crime is down, that social indicators are up. He wants the world to be in a stable place. And when I look at kind of what this administration is doing in the first month, I think they've actually done a very good job on their domestic priorities. I think DOGE is running wild in the federal bureaucracy, but that's a good thing. Sometimes that type of disruption is a good thing. I think the border has been so successful, 90% drop in illegal crossings, that the media won't even talk about it, right? But that's the number 2 issue in the 2024 election. I think inflation is going to take longer because, of course, it's hard to beat out inflation, but what Trump is doing on energy and in budget cutting and in tax policy will eventually get prices under control. What I worry about, Hugh, is foreign policy. Second-term presidents tend to throw the long ball on foreign policy, and it doesn't always work. We think of it in terms of overextension in previous presidencies, but you know what? There's a danger in withdrawal as well. There's a danger in kind of restraint as well, as paradoxical as that might seem. And so if I'm J.D. Vance, or if I'm advising J.D. Vance, I'd just say, look, you are tied to this presidency, and so you want to make it the most successful presidency possible in order to set you up down the line.
And I would add to that, watch Israel, keep Israel's back, because whether or not there's an anti-Israel element in MAGA, It's not very big. Matt Continetti,
No.
good to talk to you. Follow Matt at Continetti on X. Looking for Ben Domenech. I think he's at CPAC. I didn't hear that, Adam. Oh, Ben, how are you?
There you. Sorry, no, I'm actually down in Florida, but the cell phone coverage is going in and out because there's a bit of a storm. So.
Okay, well then I'll get right to the heart of this. Ben, I have a puzzle for you. Trump is to Zelensky as FDR was to blank, and Richard Nixon was to blank. Who are the blanks?
So I think I know where you're going to go with this, but I will concede that I've not pre-formulated an answer to this question. So off the top of my head, I'll just let you answer it.
All right, I think it says FDR was to de Gaulle, and Richard Nixon was to two, and that means they call the shots. And if FDR wants de Gaulle to go into Paris, he gets to go into Paris, and if he doesn't, he doesn't. If he wants to sink the French Navy, he does. And if Richard Nixon wants to prop up two, he can for as long as he's president. And that Zelensky got out over his skis here. What do you think?
I think that Zelensky did get out over his skis, and I think that he is not de Gaulle, whatever he is, in terms of the strength that he actually has. And I think that there's actually a fragility to him now that is very apparent after everything that he's gone through. And, it's hard to judge the man for it. He was obviously never expecting to have to deal with the kind of challenges that he's faced in leading Ukraine. I think in terms of the positioning now, though, negotiations going forward are not going to be, I think, positively impacted by what we've seen happen over the course of the past week and plus. And, I really sometimes wonder who is giving the Ukrainians the advice that they're getting. I've had different people tell me some of the issues regarding that, but it seems like a number of different things that he's said, the feints that he's done, even kind of the choices that he's made, going back to when he was coming to Washington at certain points in ways that made House Republicans feel particularly uneasy. It really, I think, hurt his own cause, unfortunately.
Matt Continetti brought up last hour. He went to Pennsylvania to do a munitions factory tour with Shapiro and a congressman who got beat.
I unfortunately did not hear Matt say that because that was literally the next thing I was going to say. Because he's basically made these bets about the outcomes of American politics that have proven to be inaccurate several times, and I think that this is one more example of that. Unfortunately for him, it could be an example of it that has some pretty severe consequences. Now, Hugh, I personally, have sort of an interesting perspective on this, I think, because I did not read a lot of the immediate coverage that was focused, just by dint of traveling, that was focused on aspects of J.D. Vance's speech other than him being rude to the Germans. And that, to me, was interesting because it's almost like the media narrative shifted very rapidly into this vein of trying to cast Vance and his perspective on foreign policy as being something new and hideous, as opposed to what I believe it to be, which is pretty consistent with President Trump. And I think that that's something that the media is clearly flailing about, trying to attack different aspects of this. But the fact that they've decided to kind of take this speech that was a very interesting commentary on Europe's own denial of Western values, and that it needed to look inward and be self-critical in a way that I think were very pointed and accurate. That's a narrative that the media didn't actually want to run with. They wanted to move on beyond that and make this about some kind of embrace of the far right, even though it was a situation where he also had attended a summit that was about finding peace in Ukraine. I think that what everyone wants in this administration is peace in Ukraine, and they do not want consistently, I've heard this, the Russians to be in a position to go back in the next couple of years. Getting to that point is key, and it's going to require negotiation and being able to move on the fly, I think, in ways that Donald Trump has shown he is capable of in the past. This is maybe the biggest one yet, though.
I want to play for you something that Secretary Rubio, said today to Catherine Herridge at the Department of State in sort of an overview of the first month. And listen closely, cut number 3.
If I can just jump in, what I'm hearing you say is that in the last 4 years, there's been a breakdown in communication with China and also Russia.
Well, interestingly enough, the communication with China has actually been better than the communication with the Russians under the Biden administration and to the current day, which is why there has to be some level of maturity here and practicality and pragmatism when it comes to foreign policy. That said, We're not going to live in a world where we depend on China for critical rare earth minerals, for critical components in our supply chain. We're not going to live in a world in which China gets to dominate the Indo-Pacific, and we're not allowed to have commercial ties in that region because they're holding countries hostage, and they all become tributary states. The Japanese have no interest in being a tributary state, and they're close allies of ours. The South Koreans, the Philippines, Australia. None of these countries want to become tributary states. Vietnam, for that matter, are not interested in becoming...
Stop right there. What did you hear there, Ben?
So first off, I want to say that Catherine Herridge interview is excellent, and I encourage people to check it out. They can find it on X, and I think I certainly shared it. I don't know if you did as well. The conversation there, I think, is one that is really disturbing in the sense that the Biden administration's approach to communication with Russia was essentially, I'm not sure to say it's non-existent, but it was not something that was happening in the way that it probably ought to have been. Now I understand that the Democrats have been on the Russia side in terms of their narrative for a long time, but that doesn't mean that you don't have actual diplomatic communication back and forth. Sometimes that's the key to coming to conclusions on issues that are like this and that we face currently. And I also heard, of course, from him that this is a situation where on the China front, we want to be able to not have to rely on them to anywhere near the degree that we have in the past. But also, what I hear in the context of that is a little bit of a pushback against some of the president's eager Silicon Valley supporters who've been coming over in his direction in recent months. That's something that is obviously a challenge for them, and their interest in the China market is not something that just went away overnight when Donald Trump got elected. And navigating that moment, and who has Donald Trump's ear on the China question, I think is going to be very important.
Ben, I hope you write about this for The Spectator, because that's a very important and very deliberate interview. Here's what I heard. I didn't hear Taiwan. I thought Atchison moment, because I heard Japan, Australia, South Korea, Philippines, even Vietnam. They don't want to be tributary states. Am I reading too much into not hearing Taiwan?
I think it's a little early to say because it's one interview, but I also think that you are onto something there in the sense that Taiwan is something that the way that they talk about it and the way that they navigate that issue is going to be very critical going forward, and language means a lot in that space. And I think that we've all seen the level of devotion, not just, by the way, in the diplomatic world, but even to the range of what they do on TikTok, the range of what they do online, the way that they have affected Hollywood in recent years. The Chinese are so sensitive about this. Even the maps of the South China Sea and exposed on ESPN, for instance, are part of the things that are consistent with this approach, where they just do not want to tolerate any kind of mention of it. Frankly, I wish that Marco Rubio had mentioned it, but I also don't want to read too much into it, given that it is just one.
All right. Now, I also have been I've been asking everyone about my construct, because lots of people who don't know national security are commenting on Trump and his team. They're everywhere, right? They got JD in Europe. They got General Kellogg in Ukraine, and in Europe they've got Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Waltz, and Special Envoy Witkoff in Saudi Arabia and other places. And I'm saying to everyone, it's all part of a square. The four squares are: Putin is evil, but Russia is a great power and can't be defeated. Hamas is evil and must be defeated. Iran is evil and could be defeated. And China is evil, but they're our greatest adversary and they have to be deterred. And that you can't really separate any national security issue. And every time I read the media, Ben, they're all treating them in isolation, and that can't be done.
Yeah, and this is the other thing, and you're completely right with that, by the way, but this is the other thing. The media likes to talk in terms of globalist perspective and the rules-based international order and blah, 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 blah. But they don't understand any of it. They don't actually understand the interconnected nature of so many of these different things. And it's amazing to me, people who cover these stories for a living don't understand how they intersect and how important it is to be hearing in this moment, for instance, that China's perspective on what's going on in Ukraine is incredibly important. It's incredibly important for all the reasons that you and I understand. And yet, from the perspective of the media's coverage of this, it basically amounts to Russia bad, we shouldn't basically even be negotiating with them. We can't be realistic about any of the potential realistic outcomes of this war. Instead, we need to live in this fantasy land where Donald Trump can wave a magic wand, and it's simply his devotion to Putin or opposition.
I would carry it on a little bit, Ben, and I'll talk to you in a minute. Russia bad, Trump bad, Israel usually bad, but we're not going to say that after the execution of the Bebas kids, and we don't know anything about China, so we won't talk about it. And they own our parent company. Ben, you know how this works. I'm scheduled to be on Special Report tonight. We pick winners and losers. May happen, may not happen. Breaking news comes in sometimes. The winner I sent in is Vice President Vance, because as Adam said of Jefferson, he has a peculiar felicity of expression. And he did those 2 speeches in Europe. He sat down at CPAC. He's on Twitter with Neil Ferguson, which is a dangerous place to be. And he's unafraid. What do you make of the vice president thus far?
You know, when J.D. Vance was picked, one of the things that I think a lot of people thought initially, especially after the shift to Kamala Harris, was that this was a riskier pick because he had such a short political career, because of the power of celebrity perhaps overwhelming, you know, the more experienced hands who the president could have gone with, and because there was this feeling that, you know, the president's going to max out his vote in Ohio anyway. You know, why don't people pick based on geography or something along those lines? I think that J.D. Vance has put to rest that notion, not just in his performance during the campaign, which got better and better and better after, frankly, having a little bit of a stumble with the launch, but then now he's showing his capacity for this role already in so many impressive ways that I can't believe that there is anybody who can look back and doubt that he was 100% the right pick. And anybody who was arguing otherwise, you know, I wasn't really arguing for one of the others, but I was just pointing out Marco Rubio is a more experienced international hand, that type of thing. But it's something to look at JD right now and say he actually has a message of to the American people, one that is consistent with, but also different than Donald Trump's.
Pause on that, because I agree. How do you see it being different from President Trump's?
I think it's different because of quite frankly, generational perspective. I think he has the perspective of a younger father, and one that actually can have a lot of appeal to especially people who've lived during the COVID experience, meaning younger parents. I keep having people come up to me and say, wow, he's impressive. And that's something that I think that is not just true of the MAGA land, you know, natural fans of Donald Trump. It's true of a lot of people who I think can be won over in future years by conservative messages that speak to that experience and that take lessons away from them that should be applied.
Ben, do you remember Peggy Noonan's 2016 piece, The Rise of the Unprotected, where she said there are the people who make public policy and the rest of us who live in it, and by the rest of us she meant the unprotected. People who don't have any margin in their life. If their car breaks down, they're screwed. If their furnace goes out, they're screwed 3 times over. If they don't have insurance and they live in the Palisades, they've been screwed and they won't be able to rebuild for 7 years. I think JD's got the perfect swing for those people.
I literally was sitting next to someone yesterday watching the USA-Canada hockey game. No reason to know that it was political. We start talking, of course, and it turns to politics. And he brings up watching the J.D. Vance movie with his girlfriend, who has a young child, and talking about their experience growing up in an RV park together. Now he has his own company, and that kind of thing. And that's exactly the kind of younger person who has been through this most recent experience and come away with it, learning lessons, who should be watching that story and who should be paying attention to this young vice president, who I think is inspiring a lot of people.
I wanted to talk to Ben Domenech about the horror show in Gaza yesterday, because he's the father of young children. I'm the grandfather of young babies. I haven't been that horrified since 10/7, and I don't care what Israel does now. But what do you think, Ben?
I don't think anybody can look at that and have a different reaction that doesn't come from the most morally convoluted, backwards impression of the way that the world works. It's just horrible and astonishing, but it's also something that, quite frankly, Hugh, I was not surprised by. My wife was surprised by it. I had been sort of sensitively, navigating around her comments, hoping that against hope that there was still some possibility of a different outcome. But I truly believe that this was the case, and that Hamas was hiding it, and that they were preparing to try to navigate it as best that they could, which is, of course, clumsily, disrespectfully, and horribly, because they are as awful of an entity that exists in the world today. And I think
they're barbarians. Now,
yeah.
have the news caught up with you that Mrs. Bebos was not in the coffin?
Yes.
Okay.
And I am, of course, I'm horrified by it. But in the catalog of things, there's so much in favor. The wind is at the back of Israel at this moment. I think the American people will stand with them, whatever they decide to do. And it really, who can blame them at this point? This is such a devastating proof of how evil the other side is in this conflict. And I can't. I mean, for Americans who haven't paid attention to this, who didn't pay as close attention to this, I think it comes as a real shock for them. And for those who don't understand how evil Hamas really is, it's a wake-up call.
And now, we were talking about understanding the president, President Trump. I've noted over 10 years, he reacts viscerally to cruelty, especially to children, whether it's in Syria, whether it's happening to young people in Ukraine. I think he already had an understanding with the prime minister when Netanyahu came to the United States. I can't imagine Trump being a restraining force here on whatever Netanyahu wants to do. Can you?
No, I think this is going to be let the dogs run, and that's a situation where, Hamas brought this on themselves with their villainy and their action, and the president, you make note of that. I was standing in the Oval when he made remarks about the Ukraine war, where he was talking about the bodies of young people being ripped apart by bullets.
Yep.
Not a lot of people pay attention to that aspect of him, and I think you're completely correct. He reacts in a way. And it's by the way, I think it's also one of the reasons that he leaned so far into this is obviously not the same thing at all, but just caring about the boys and girls sports issue, where lots of people in the kind of corporate right were like, oh, this is making us uncomfortable or something like that. No, he viewed it as a violation. He viewed it as something that was horrible being done to young girls, and that's something that, when he talks about it again, he talks about it in a very visceral way, and I think that's because
I have an example for you, Ben. From the White House today, Donald Trump, all the governors of the states are there, including Janet Mills of Maine, and here it is, cut 14.
The NCAA has complied immediately, by the way. That's good. But I understand Maine. Is Maine here, the governor of Maine? Well, are you not going to comply with it?
I'm complying with state and federal laws.
We are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding.
See you in court.
Every state, good. I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one.
Ben, first of all,
your life after governor,
I follow Janet Mills because I spent a lot of time in Maine, and she's double A ball, and this is MLB. All right, This is not where she should be playing. I'll see you in court. What do you make of that? Who wins that message exchange?
Some people lose their fastball. Some people never had it, and that's my takeaway from that exchange. And clearly, I think this. Look, if Democrats like the governor do not want to take any lessons from this, other than America's racist and foolish, and we just needed better messaging, then they are not going to be able to come back from it. And the sooner that you have idiots who think that they can win on this issue, where they have been clearly on the wrong end, deluded by the people who have been advising them for so long, they're going to continue to lose elections, and they're going to continue to be surprised by it.
Last word on this, Ben. There are 1.2 million people in Maine. I spend a lot of time there. Portland has 68,000. It's as crunchy blue as you get. But, you get up to the county or down east, and it ain't blue. And I saw the picture of the pole vaulter, and I don't want to pick on a trans girl. I don't know what the rules are. All I saw was that the girls who finished second, third, and fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh were not in a hurry from the pictures to congratulate the trans girl who beat them by a half foot.
No, it's absolutely astounding. And again, as the father of two little girls, it's one of these things where you understand it. It is a point of instant radicalization on an issue when you see something this obvious and this unjust. And look, the president realizes it. The people around him realize it. And until Democrats just recognize that they are completely on the wrong side on this issue, not just politically, but morally, ethically, et cetera, they're going to be learning, I think, some hard lessons on it.
All right, Stinger. Isn't David Hogg the greatest thing to happen to the Republican Party in years?
It's a gift. I can't believe that they did this. It's so amazing to see him working already, and I think he's going to continue to be a great boon. You couldn't plan a better situation for the arguments that Republicans are making than putting someone like him in this kind of.
Yeah, I feel bad for the kid because he's trapped in being famous at the age of 18 for all the wrong reasons, and then he just works his fame, and that's just a dead end. It's like being a child actor, Ben. It's actually a bad thing.
Yes, it is, and I think that there's a lot of similarity there. You're rushed to the front of the line much earlier than you should be, and you don't have the kind of experience that will allow you to sort of learn. You're supposed to know everything and get everything right, and there's so many people who've been ruined by that in other industries, and that can happen in politics as well.
Ben Domenech, thank you. Always a pleasure. Enjoy your vacation, Ben. I appreciate the extra time. We found him. We interrupted him. And it's almost dinner, and his wife is probably mad at me. Please apologize for me.
No. Thanks. Thanks as always.
B. Domenech on X. Read him at The Spectator. See him on Fox News. I don't ever think I've got him on vacation before. Let me tell you about American Federal, my friends that buy and sell gold. Gold dropped $15 today. But you say, well, what's that mean? That means nothing. Okay, gold went down $15. Actually, it's only $2 from 2 days ago, so I don't know what's going on. But NASDAQ down 2.2%. The S&P down 1.71%. The Dow Jones down 1.69%. I don't know why. I know that United Healthcare had bad numbers, but does United Healthcare run the markets? I don't know. But gold doesn't react that way. Gold is a safe haven. It's not as safe as cash, but it's pretty safe. It's always kept up with inflation over the past 100 years. If you want to learn about gold, call Nick Grovich, 1-800-221-7694. 1-800-221-7694. Congressman John Campbell, former Congressman Campbell, is going to be guest hosting for me on Tuesday. He was in today. He's already talked to Nick. He's going to go see Nick when he goes back to Arizona, but he's going to guest host for me on Tuesday when I have to be out. And he said he's going to go see Nick because they've had a couple of conversations already. Everybody I know who does anything with Nick just loves American Federal. AmericanFederal.com. 1-800-221-7694. If you're going to buy or sell gold, do it with Nick and his team at AmericanFederal.com. Just sending a note to Harley, who cuts up highly concentrated hue for the big weekend show. And the big weekend show will begin with the first segment of the show, as it always does. And then it'll play this segment, which is segment 4 of hour 2. Then it's going to play all of Continenti and all of Domenech. And it turns out that thousands of you begin your morning by downloading Highly Concentrated Hue, my podcast, or the entire show from the day before, which is over at YouTube by 8 p.m. Out west, 11 p.m. in the east, and you begin your morning with it. And that's fine with me. I don't care when you listen. I want you to know, though, what's going on. And to that end, I want you to hear just a little bit of National Security Advisor Waltz at the CPAC today, talking about China and the Panama Canal, cut number 10.
President Trump is who pivoted us, pivoted the whole national security apparatus back in 2017 and 2018 to deal with the threat and the competition that China is. But he firmly believes we can win this economically, we can win this through our supply chains, we can win this through our markets in fair trade deals, and at the same time rebuilding our great military under, how about our Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, right? Getting them focused on being the most lethal and most badass military in the world and projecting that strength. But at the same time, he appreciates the infiltration that's going on, and we just had Panama say, you know what, we're done with Belt and Road, we're done with allowing China to infiltrate critical strategic assets like the Panama Canal. And again, it's only been a month, folks. We've still got it. We told the president, you said, you have a full 4 years. We don't have to get it all done in 4 weeks. And just final thing, because you mentioned fentanyl. We are going to unleash holy hell on the cartels. Enough is enough. We are securing our border.
Last night, talking just to the Republican governors, said this, cut number 7.
On day one, I declared a national emergency on our southern border. I sent our military to the border to secure the sovereign territory of the United States of America. We ended catch and release. We began the largest deportation operation in American history, larger even than that of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. You know, he was sort of a moderate guy, but he was very strong on the fact he didn't want people pouring into our country from all over the world. He was very tough. He had the record. We now have the record. It's not a record I'm really proud of. You don't like to do that, but we have no choice. We can't let it. I mean, they let criminals, many, many criminals, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of criminals, 21 million people, I believe, is the number. And of that, millions of people are hard, stone-cold criminals. In the past 4 weeks, illegal border crossings have plummeted by nearly 100%, and the tiny number of illegals that do make it across are being apprehended and sent right back to their home where they belong. All countries are taking the illegal aliens back, every single one, even though they said, and strongly, we're never taking them back. Don't even try. They said that during the Biden administration. It didn't work. They're taking them back. They have no choice. They're taking them back. They know we're not playing games.
He's not playing games. He went on to say this, cut number 8.
Just this week, I officially designated the drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, including Trendy Aragua and MS-13, which gives us great power.
Now, he also said a lot of things to the RGA. He said this about Fort Knox, and I don't get this, but maybe I'll have to call Nick Grovich at AmericanFederal.com. Kind of thought the gold was there, but cut number 6.
And I'm going to do something. I'm actually going on this one. You know, all my life I've heard about Fort Knox. That's where the gold is kept, right? I heard Fort Knox, oh. But, you know, we're getting a little bit shaky. We're getting the yips on this stuff. Like, I want to find out. So we're going to open up the doors. I'm going to see if we have gold there. We want to find out. Did anybody steal the gold in Fort Knox? It's a pretty amazing place. But I'm going to actually go. We're going to open the doors. We're going to inspect Fort Knox. We want to make sure that we actually have, you know, 400 tons of gold or whatever the hell it is. It's a lot of gold. I don't want to open it and the cupboards are bare. Could happen.
Al Capone's safe. That would be a bad day for America. That would make markets jump a little bit. Cut number 9.
I'm thrilled to be with the Republican governors, and they have done an amazing job, and I look forward to working with each and every one of you as we complete the mission of saving America. They left us a real mess, didn't they, huh? And making our country great again. We're going to do it. We've made a lot of progress. So we're giving credit for having the best 4 weeks that anybody's ever had.
He's had a great 4 weeks. He has had a great 4 weeks. So great. Last night, Caitlin from CNN tried to get Mike Waltz to disagree with him. Today, Politico is trying to divide up Team Trump again. Not going to work. Not going to work. Wouldn't be prudent to do that, CNN. You're going to lose your viewer. There's not a cloud in sight for Donald Trump. I don't think there ever is. I mean, he is the most relentlessly optimistic person I think I've seen on the public stage. And he can be, some would call him ruthlessly honest. He just tells you what. In fact, I want to play for you why Janet Mills stepped on the rake today. It's not like the whole country didn't see the pole vaulting thing. We did. Everyone on social media did. And they said, that's not right. And then, people who are very sympathetic to children with gender dysphoria, very sympathetic to that, but also quite ferocious in their defense of girls and women's sports. So last night, Donald Trump at the RGA says this, cut number 5.
And I heard men are still playing in Maine. Is anybody here from Maine? Who is that? Is that the governor? That's, well, I hate to tell you this, but we're not going to give them any federal money. They are still saying we want men to play in women's sports, and I cannot believe that they're doing that. They are, let's find out who that guy is that raised his hand. Maybe he's just kidding. But, so we're not going to give him any federal funding, none whatsoever, until they clean that up.
There aren't any statewide elected officials in Maine who are Republican, except Susan Collins, and she's not a governor. And I think Susan Collins agrees with the president on this. I think 80% of America agrees with the president on this. Great sympathy for young folks with gender dysphoria and great sympathy for how they have to adjust and deal with life as adults, but not sympathetic to transgendered girls in girls' sports or transgendered women in women's sports. So that happened last night. So someone was there from Maine. Might have been Brian the banker. Could have been Tony Two Speeds. All my buddies. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they'd be doing at the RGA, but there aren't any Republicans in Maine. So one of my buddies from up there, and they turn around and they bring all the governors. So Donald Trump goes to talk to the Republican governors on Thursday night. And on Friday, as is the tradition, all the governors are invited to the White House. And so they all come, and that means Janet, what's Janet's last name? I can't even remember what her last name is now. How can I not remember Janet? Well, let's just play it. Cut number 14. Mills, Janet Mills.
The NCAA has complied immediately, by the way. That's good. But I understand Maine. Is Maine here, the governor of Maine? Are you not going to comply with it?
I'm complying with state and federal laws.
We are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding. Every state, good. I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one. And enjoy your life after governor because I don't think you'll be in elected politics.
I sometimes marvel at people who think they can go back at the president in the White House. The press has done it off and on for 10 years now, 2015 to 2025, on the campaign trail, in debates, in the White House. They think they're going to score on Evan Mobley and Jared Allen, and it's not going to happen. That's why the Cavaliers are the best. I mean, sometimes you score on them, but the odds aren't good, especially if you're seated in out-of-camera range and the president's at the podium in the White House. And he says on an 80-20 issue, men should not be in women's sports, girls should not be in boys' sports. And the governor, who's all lined up. All right, so she's done. Maybe she got nothing left to do, and she wants to get some gold bars from the next Titanic. If there ever is another, if you haven't watched Lee Zeldin at EPA, you don't know about that scandal. But the Democrats over at the EPA just threw $20 billion out the window at NGOs and left-wing organizations, and they made a video about it. So Lee Zeldin found it, and Doge found it, and I hope that Pam Bondi finds it, and they go find all those people because they broke all sorts of rules, and if they lie about it, they've broken the law. And I think the Democrats don't know how to get out of the hole that they have dug. The first rule of holes. What is the first rule of holes, Dwayne? The first rule of holes. Yeah. What's the first rule of holes?
Well, you stop digging normally.
You stop digging. And so Janet Mills should have said what to the president?
We are going to review the policy and hope to get in line with federal policy soon.
You don't have to go that far. You can say, you got Democratic constituencies. And I got to tell you, Portland is about as left-wing as you can get. And think of San Francisco on the East Coast. So she's got to say something like, I hear you, Mr. President, and we're going to review the policy. Right? How hard is that?
It's not that hard. And you saw the picture of her afterwards?
No.
She had this frumpy look on her face, a scowl on her face because she got called out. And you're not gonna win that kind of a contest.
Ask Lilacs about that next week, will you? Ask Lilacs about that next week.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
Is Dwayne's World dropped?
Dwayne's World did drop today, yes.
All right. So if anyone didn't get enough of me and you don't get enough of YouTube, go to Dwayne's World, Dwayne.world, or go wherever your podcasts are and get Dwayne's World. Time for that time of the week where I check in with Tarzana Joe, the poet laureate of the Hugh Hewitt Show. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Hugh. This poem is a response to a listener request. And as you know, I do requests, and it's dedicated to a Salem colleague.
Oh.
You may remember that Dennis Prager, for years, introduced his show as a program where we speak about everything in the world except poetry. Now, then a caller mentioned a poem in a discussion, and out of a sense of honor, he stopped saying that. I think he substituted architecture, and then he dropped the whole thing. But this is for Dennis. He is no friend of poetry, but still a friend of mine, for I've been tuning in since, well, religion on the line. Ooh. And in a world of conflict, of arguments and yelling, who'd think that calm reflection could be so darn compelling? He's guided us through concepts both simple and mysterious, that males are not like females and happiness is serious. He's pondered tenets of the East and values from the West, and leaves no doubt in listeners of those he thinks are best. And like the best professors, he's often quite demanding, though not to force agreement, but rather understanding. Then came a moment unforeseen as fate has laid him low. We learned for weeks and weeks on end that it was touch and go. Silenced by a sudden fall, it seems to us absurd. Some stood, some bowed, some knelt, but we all put in a word. Can he feel the wave of prayers? Well, if I had to guess, I'd think, then think a second time, and always answer yes. And we'll continue praying. We've made that act our choice, until again we're tuning in to hear his friendly voice. That's Get Well Dennis by Tiger Schmidt and Tarzana Joe.
Tiger suggested it?
Tiger Schmidt.
Well, Tiger, well done, well prompted. Joe, well delivered, elegant. I am certain that Dennis will be getting that, and I am certain that Susan will be checking at tarzanajoe.com to see it posted tonight. Tarzana Joe can be, of course, inquired of, prompted anytime you want by writing him at tarzanajoe at Reagan.com, tarzanajoe at Reagan.com, but tarzanajoe.com is where you find the poem. Momentary block there. tarzanajoe at Reagan.com. Rates and words are reasonable for all your poetry needs. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Harley. Thank you, Dwayne. I'm coming back with Wilfred McClay. This is a special Hillsdale Dialogue coming up, a very special Hillsdale Dialogue. Can't tell you, I've been waiting to talk to Wilfred McClay. Now, I promised you that we were going to do this week My Early Life by Churchill with Dr. Arnold, but he's been called away, so we're going to do that next week. But today I'm going to talk with Dr. Wilfred McClay. Professor McClay is the Victor Davis Hanson Chair in Classical and Ancient History at Hillsdale College, and his book, Land of Hope, is the best textbook on American history out there.